bunker-busting British stealth missiles have smashed through Russian air defenses in what Ukraine has called a massive attack on Russian soil. Storm Shadow bunker-busting missiles were used as part of a joint operation involving Ukraine's Air Force, Navy, Army and other units to attack an explosives factory in Russia's Bryansk region, some 80 miles inside Russian territory. Now, the first time Storm Shadow missiles were used to attack targets on Russian soil, Moscow responded by firing an Oreshnik ballistic missile at Ukraine. That was an experimental intermediate-range ballistic missile which blasts up to the edge of space before hurtling down on a target, and in that instance, in Dnipro, at speeds of 13,000 miles per hour. Ukraine has said that this latest instance of using the Storm Shadows was part of a major joint operation involving airstrikes and missile attacks against this factory, which it says makes explosives, gunpowder, and parts for missiles, all of which have been used to shell and attack the territory of Ukraine. So far, there hasn't been any explicit Russian response, and Ukraine's armed forces have said they are still assessing the damage, but at least one pro-Russian war blogger has described this strike as a disaster. Although overnight in Ukraine, there have been a number of attacks in that same pattern of relentless nighttime strikes, particularly targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And President Vladimir Zelensky said at least 6 people were killed, including 2 children, and a dozen more people have been injured. There are rolling blackouts across the country and delays to the train infrastructure as a result of that strain on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Of course, this comes against a backdrop of tense international relations and stalling efforts led by President Donald Trump to try and broker an end, or at the very least a ceasefire in this conflict, which is claiming hundreds, if not thousands, of lives across the front line every day. Donald Trump had suggested that he and President Putin were going to meet in Budapest, the capital of Hungary. Hungary has been amongst the most pro-Russian countries within Europe throughout the course of this conflict, but plans for that face-to-face meeting appear to have collapsed this week after Russia's Foreign Secretary Sergei Lavrov and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that their planned meeting had been called off, and that meeting was supposed to be in advance of the leaders. President Zelensky met President Trump last week. There were hopes that at that meeting, Donald Trump might make good on his suggestion that he would give Ukraine Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. Tomahawks have a range of around 2,500 kilometers, significantly bigger than any weapon in Ukraine's arsenal at the moment, and that would put a Shahed drone factory deep inside Russian territory within easy striking distance, and hundreds of other Russian military targets, although finding a way for Ukraine to launch Tomahawks would be fraught with complications because most of them are launched from ships or submarines. There are ground-launched options, but there are far fewer of them. Anyway, Donald Trump did not make good on that suggestion when he met President Zelensky. And in fact, there were reports he told Zelensky he has to accede to Putin's demands or risk being crushed in this conflict. The tone of that latest meeting, much closer to the disastrous Oval Office meeting 6 months ago at the start of this year. And it has led once again, as we saw after that meeting, to a rallying around Zelensky of Ukraine's closest allies, its European allies and European leaders. And Zelensky is due in London later this week to discuss next steps for him, for Ukraine, and indeed for European NATO allies who are supporting him.